Welcome to the Authority File, the academic library podcast from Choice. This episode is made possible with help from Rowman and Littlefield. I'm Bill Mickey, the host of the podcast and editorial director for Choice, and we're very pleased to welcome Joe Janes to the program. Joe is the author of a book recently published by Rowman and Littlefield called Documents That Change the Way We Live. It's a fascinating book that examines documents and other information objects from thousands of years ago all the way up to today. Joe's descriptions of these items weave in historical and archival context, but always focus on their informational value, especially how a document's particular definition changes over time. How a ballot or a birth certificate goes from a mundane formality to something that changes the course of history, for example. When he's not busy writing books, Joe is associate professor at the University of Washington Information School. He is a frequent speaker, and he has authored several books on librarianship and technology, and is the creator of and host of Documents That Change the World, a popular podcast series that he based his latest book on. In this first episode of our four-part series that highlights some of the documents that Joe writes about in his book, we'll talk with Joe about how the book came together, why these documents are worthy of exploration, and how they have an uncanny ability to take on new meaning depending on their historical context. Joe Janes, welcome to the Authority File.
Thank you.
So the collection of documents that you write about in your book began life as a podcast series. When did you start the podcast, and was the book a part of the plan all along?
It's been almost exactly 5 years now, actually a little more. I started this in 2012, initially inspired, I think, by the series that the British Museum and the BBC did a few years ago on the history of the world in 100 objects.
Oh, right.
And I think that just lodged in my head, and then a few months later, out came the title. And there it was. And got a graduate student, Andrew Brink, to help me do the first couple of episodes to sort of figure out how to do it. I never thought that it would have any life beyond that. It never occurred to me as a book. It just it seemed to fit the podcast format, which I really enjoyed doing and right. Thought was a good venue. And so, yeah, no, it all just kind of happened after that.
So you came up with the title first, and then it wasn't like you came across a document or something and thought, well, I'd like to find more of these.
No, I mean, this is sort of one of those things that I think have been ticking along in my head for a long time without having a name for it or a way to do it or anything. And then when the pieces fell into place, sitting in a coffee shop one day as I wrote the title down on a yellow pad, thought, oh, wow, that sounds kind of cool. I wonder what that would be. And here I am. Okay.
Tell us, give us a sense of how you found or selected the documents and items in your collection, and what perhaps are the criteria that you used to, I guess, quote unquote, approve them for more analysis.
Yeah, it's a combination of a couple of things. First of all, things that interest me. If you start these things as podcasts, you're not answerable to anybody. So it's like, wow, that's fascinating. I want to know more about that, or I want to know more about that, or I really feel like I should know that, but I don't. And then once I started, I wanted to try to choose things that would represent different periods of time, different kinds of documents, different kinds of stories. I didn't want to have all the same thing. And so then it became, I wanted to do a will for a long time, but I couldn't think of a will to do. And then it occurred to me that Alfred Nobel had a will, and that's what set up the Nobel Prizes. And so that's how that happened. So sometimes it started with, I always wondered more about this, or it started with a form, or it started with a time period, like, I don't have anything from, I don't have anything medieval. What have I got that I haven't done yet? And so the inspirations have all been kind of erratic, but primarily I haven't done anything that I wasn't personally fascinated by, so which covers a lot of territory.
Right. So you point out, in your preface that you're not approaching this project as a historian or an archivist. You don't really have any, I suppose, any formal training in either of those, but instead as a information scientist and librarian, which of course you are, how does this, distinction in your mind play out in your curation and explanation of the documents? What's your angle on them as an information scientist?
There certainly is a lot of history here, and one of the things that I wanted to do with all of these was provide some context, not only about the documents themselves, but also the time periods. So try to locate these in people's heads. They have some idea what else was going on in the world. But I'm not a trained historian. I've always been I read a lot of popular history and so on. Nor am I an archivist. I did take archives in graduate school, but that was a long time ago. But for me, I often found myself as I was doing the research and then thinking about these things is, what's the information story here? What do I have to say about these things that a historian wouldn't, or an archivist wouldn't, or someone who's a specialist in that area wouldn't? And there were many things that I just couldn't find a handle on, or couldn't find a good story around, or couldn't quite find the narrative thread. But the Rosetta Stone is a great example. One of the things I decided early on was I didn't want to do Magna Carta. What am I going to say about Magna Carta that hasn't been said by 10,000 people before me? Or the Declaration of Independence, or the Bill of Rights, or in those. So the Rosetta Stone was on that list. And I thought, oh, for crying out loud, what am I going to say about the Rosetta Stone? Well, then I wind up in London on my honeymoon. We wind up at the British Museum, and there's the Rosetta Stone. And the docent is talking about the Rosetta Stone and how it has 4 languages on it, not 3, because the British wrote on the sides of it when they took it over from the French. And now I have an information story.
There you go.
Now we can talk about the Rosetta Stone and all the various things that it's been and guises that it's been and work that it's done and so on. And now I have an information story. That was otherwise it's the Rosetta Stone, which everybody knows, except they don't.
Well, there's several examples of that, throughout the book, where you take what might be a document that plenty of people know about and have studied, but there is this interesting little quirk about it that maybe not that many people know about, and you kind of focus on that as sort of the angle of your approach to that.
Well, the other one that comes to mind is the Declaration of Independence, which, oh my God, we hear about that every year. So, and again, that's territory that has been well trod for a long time. But then there's the passage from the Declaration of Independence that talked about the slave trade and that was deleted before it was approved. Well, so the story is about what isn't there.
Yep,
not exactly. What is there that we celebrate every year and set off fireworks and have hot dogs and so on. The story about what isn't there and why it isn't there and how it isn't there, which we really don't know because it's not in the meeting minutes of the Continental Congress. And so I read the original journal of the Continental Congress, their minutes, and it said the thing was approved, and the next thing that they did was approve the rental of a boat. 5 minutes after they approved the Declaration of Independence. Well, nobody painted that.
Yeah.
So those are the kinds of things that are just a little bit off center that people don't kind of get. And I think they provide a little more color, a little more feeling for where these things came from, even the things that we all think we know, the things that where they came from and how they came to be and what that tells us about documents and information objects in general.
Right. And speaking of information objects, I mean, some of the stories you're telling here are not necessarily about documents exactly, but, you have film, a ticker tape, a ballot, for example. I mean, why stretch that definition of document?
Well, there's a couple things. There are very straightforward things that were never meant to be anything more interesting than what they are that wound up becoming way more important. The Palm Beach ballot is a great example of that.
Right.
The butterfly ballot from 2000 that most people think the results of the 2000 election hinged on. The woman who designed the ballot, she's in Palm Beach County. A quarter of her residents are old, and she wanted big type, and that changed the design of the ballot, and that confused people, and George Bush got elected president, and there we are.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's it's not strange to think of a ballot as a document. It's not the normal sense of the word, but then, so I wanted to kind of give a general audience. I mean, people listening to this, librarians, information people, et cetera, we're used to the idea that lots of things can document, but most people aren't. So the idea of a quilt, the idea of a memorial wall, the idea of a film, the idea of something that doesn't even exist. McCarthy's list of communists, which never existed, but everybody believed it did, and so they acted like it did. Right. The 18.5-minute gap in the Nixon tapes. I mean, these kinds of things are just ways of kind of tweaking people's thinking and understanding about what can document, what can record, what can bear information, that kind of broadens their notion of what information objects are. And then by extension, hey, that those of us who work with information for a living, like librarians and archivists and museum folks, et cetera, we've got it all here. So, we're really important. Pay attention to us. We know what we're doing.
Our guest this week, Joe Janes, appears courtesy of Rowman and Littlefield. Documents are milestones and markers of human activity, part of who and what we are. Our story can be told through the objects, profound and trivial, famous and forgotten, by which we remember and are remembered. Jane's new book, Documents That Change the Way We Live, examines dozens of compelling stories that describe these documents, focusing on their creation, motivation, influence, context, and their connections to contemporary life. Documents That Change the Way We Live and even more books about books are available from Rowman and Littlefield. If you're purchasing the book from Rowman.com, that's ROWMAN.com, use the promo code Joe Janes, all one word, that's JOEJANES, to save 30% off the cover price. What's interesting when I was going through the book, you come out and say that you're not taking sides, in any of your descriptions of most of the documents. You're trying to stay objective for the most part. But especially now, I mean, it's hard to even look at the name of some of these documents and not and objects, and not see some kind of political or other kind of subtext going on. So what is it then, I guess, that about some of these documents, especially the ones that when they were created were non-political, that evoke these kinds of feelings? For example, Obama's birth certificate, the ballot that you mentioned. Yeah. They didn't start out as purely, political documents, but they've since taken on this sort of extra meaning. The one that got one of the bigger responses when I did it as a podcast episode that I was quite surprised by was the Book of Mormon. And so it turns out I was raised very near where the Book of Mormon was transcribed. Let's use that word. So I grew up sort of knowing about it, but I never knew the whole story, and I did the digging and got the whole story. And that's an example of I got several responses from several people in the LDS Church saying thank you for not making fun of us, for taking us seriously, because it's very easy. The origin story of the Book of Mormon is it's easy to describe it as ludicrous. Joseph Smith is barely literate. His wife said he wasn't smart enough to write a letter, let alone dictate a 700-page book. The book doesn't make a great deal of sense. It contradicts the historical record, and yet nobody's come up with a better solution. It's not. If it's plagiarized, they don't have the original source. If somebody else wrote it, we don't know who it is because people watched him do it. So I don't have a better origin story than theirs. I don't believe it, but I didn't want to come out and say that. Because I don't have a better answer. If I thought I knew the answer, I would say so, but I don't. Yeah. So it's not my job to tell people that the Book of Mormon is fiction. The musical I can recommend, but the original Book of Mormon, right. But for many of these things, I mean, Obama's birth certificate is a birth certificate. He was born just a few months before I was. Nobody pays the slightest attention to my birth certificate or yours or anybody else's. But I'm not running for president. And his,
we all know, or most of us know, the whole story and the the birther business, and the people who criticize when the Hawaii Health Department issued the PDF version. People criticized the PDF version as a fake because the layers were in the wrong order or some crazy stuff like that.
Yeah.
So the how these things are perceived at various points in their lives is part of the story as well.
Right.
And the Obama birth certificate will never be what it once was, which is a simple record of the details of his birth. It will never be that again, because it will always carry these for centuries, because he was president of the United States. For the rest of American history, it will bear those traces.
Yep.
And it can't not do. But nobody paid any attention to Joe Biden's birth certificate. I imagine people looked at it, but who cares?
Right. Got to tick that box and move on.
Yeah, and on we go.
Yeah. The documents obviously span millennia. I mean, what are some of the archival insights, I guess, that you've been able to take away from the project in a broad sense? I mean, these days, is it even remotely possible that a potentially important document might not get preserved? Or, I mean, a lot of some of the items in your book are it's sort of a stroke of luck that they even still exist, or they've sort of evolved into this sort of larger than life kind of item. But now everything is sort of documented and preserved and so meticulously. Looking back over everything that you've studied so far, what are your sort of impressions of the way things are preserved and documented and archived?
Well, you asked, are there potentially important things that are not being saved or preserved? And that's happening every second of every day.
Yeah.
And to be honest, it always has. We've heard a lot over the last 20 years or so about a digital dark age, because nobody saves drafts of letters anymore. Nobody saves correspondence. I did research at the Motion Picture Academy Library a few years ago, and was talking to some of their librarians about they have an incredible screenplay collection. And they said at the time that they would talk to contemporary screenwriters and say, what do you do about drafts? Because you're changing the scenes and writing characters out, and that's fascinating for film historians.
Yeah.
And one librarian said that a screenwriter said to her, when the film wraps, I just hit delete. And she had this horrified look on her face, much like I do now.
Yeah.
And I mean, when I was down there, they showed me the shooting script for High Noon that was all folded up with pencil marks on it and everything. And it was what the director had in the back pocket when he was shooting the film, which, just doesn't exist anymore. But hundreds, thousands of years ago, there's all kinds of stuff that's missing. There are voids and gaps in the record as far back as you want to go.
Right.
So, yes, it's different that we're losing. I mean, so much more stuff is being created and so much more stuff is being lost, but it's always been hit or miss.
Right.
With something that's been published, like a book or a magazine article or something, there's lots and lots of copies, and those are far more likely to survive. The Rosetta Stone, there are actually multiple Rosetta Stones, and several of them have been found, but that the one that's famous is the one in the British Museum. There's all kinds of stuff from the early record that will never surface because all the copies are destroyed.
Right.
Greek plays, all this other stuff. So it's always hit and miss, particularly with single purpose things, with individual documents or letters or wills or whatever. And there's really nothing new about that. And in many cases, it's accident. We have the Rosetta Stone because somebody hacked it into pieces and used it as a foundation stone for a fort for 1,000 years. And then it got dug up when the French invaded Egypt during the Napoleonic Wars. Completely happenstance. Absolutely. Right. God knows what the things that we don't have. Not to mention the things that are intentionally destroyed or censored or burned It's a crapshoot at the best of times.
You just heard from Joe Janes, Associate Professor at the University of Washington Information School and author of Documents That Changed the Way We Live. Joe is a frequent speaker, and he's authored several books on librarianship and technology, and he is the creator and host of Documents That Changed the World, a popular podcast series that he based his latest book on. This concludes episode 1 of our 4-part series with Joe, where we discuss some of the documents he profiles in his book. This episode was brought to you by Rowman and Littlefield and Choice. Be sure to join us for episode 2 when we talk about Webster's dictionary. There's more to it than you might think.
Noah Webster is this kind of vague, everybody's heard of him but nobody knows him kind of figure, and there's a lot going on there.
You can search for and listen to all of the episodes of the Authority File podcast on iTunes, Google Play, and Stitcher, or you can find us on the Choice website at choice360.org. Just click on the librarianship drop-down. If you do listen to us on iTunes or Stitcher, be sure to give us a review. We hope you like what you hear. In the meantime, you can find out more about Choice Reviews and get updates on the latest podcast episodes on the Choice Reviews Facebook page or on Twitter at choice_reviews. Search for or comment on the podcast using hashtag #TheAuthorityFile. Thank you for joining us today.